You might be doing everything right during the day, eating well, staying active, managing stress, and still sleeping badly, still waking exhausted, still gaining weight you can't explain. I'm Megan Corvale. What I'm covering today are 5 things that research shows you should never do in the hours before bed after 40. Not because they're obviously harmful, but because of what they do to the specific hormonal and neurological systems that change after 40. Number 1 is something the majority of people do every single night without a second thought. 5 things. Let's go. Number 5, eating a large meal within 2 hours of sleep. Late eating is one of the most normalized habits in modern life. Long work days, family schedules, social meals, dinner at 8, 9, sometimes 10 p.m. is simply how life works for a significant portion of people over 40, and the consequences for sleep quality, hormonal health, and body composition are substantial enough that understanding the mechanism is genuinely worth your time. The most immediate problem is digestive. Your gastrointestinal system is governed by circadian biology. It is designed to process food efficiently during daylight hours and to slow significantly in the evening as your body prepares for the restorative processes of sleep. Eating a large meal close to sleep means your digestive system is working hard during the hours it is supposed to be winding down. The result is disrupted sleep onset, increased core body temperature from the thermogenic effect of digestion, which directly delays sleep, and a higher likelihood of acid reflux, which fragments sleep architecture even when it does not fully wake you. But the deeper issue for people over 40 is hormonal. The largest pulse of human growth hormone your body produces in any 24-hour period occurs during the first bout of slow-wave sleep, typically 1 to 2 hours after sleep onset. Growth hormone is the primary overnight repair and regeneration signal. It drives muscle protein synthesis, fat mobilization, cellular repair, and the metabolic restoration that determines how you feel the following day. Growth hormone secretion is directly and potently suppressed by insulin. When you eat a large meal, particularly one containing significant carbohydrate, within 2 hours of sleep, insulin is still elevated when that first slow-wave sleep window arrives. The growth hormone pulse is blunted or eliminated entirely. The same restoration that should have occurred overnight either doesn't happen or happens incompletely. After 40, growth hormone production is already declining as a function of age. What you cannot afford is to further suppress what remains through the timing of your last meal. Every night of blunted growth hormone is a night of incomplete muscle repair, reduced overnight fat oxidation, and diminished cellular renewal, a cost that compounds visibly across months and years. There is a second hormonal consequence that is rarely discussed. Eating late keeps the body in the fed metabolic state, where insulin is elevated and fat burning is switched off, for the first several hours of sleep. The transition to the fasted state, where the body begins mobilizing stored fat as overnight fuel, is delayed proportionally. For someone trying to manage body composition after 40, this is not a trivial loss. Several hours of overnight fat oxidation, eliminated night after night by late eating, represents a metabolic deficit that no amount of daytime discipline fully compensates for. Pro tip: a 3-hour gap between your last meal and sleep protects the growth hormone window and ensures you enter the fasted metabolic state before the most hormonally valuable hours of the night begin. If genuine hunger makes this difficult, a small amount of protein, a few tablespoons of plain Greek yogurt or a small handful of nuts, has a far lower insulin response than carbohydrate-based snacks and will not significantly delay the transition. What to avoid entirely in the 2 hours before bed? Anything high in refined carbohydrate or sugar, large portions of any food, and alcohol, which carries its own sleep architecture consequences we will come to. Number 4, drinking alcohol to wind down. This is the habit with the largest gap between perception and physiological reality on this entire list. Alcohol is used as a sleep aid by an enormous number of people over 40. It reliably reduces the time it takes to fall asleep, produces a feeling of relaxation and drowsiness, and is socially and culturally embedded in the evening wind-down routine to a degree that makes questioning it feel excessive. The reality is that alcohol is one of the most potent disruptors of sleep architecture identified in the research, and the specific way it disrupts sleep is precisely targeted at the stages that become most precious and most fragile after 40. Here is what alcohol actually does to the sleeping brain. In the first half of the night, alcohol increases slow-wave sleep. This is why it feels like it improves sleep. You fall asleep faster and sleep more deeply in those first few hours. But alcohol is metabolized relatively quickly, and as blood alcohol levels drop in the second half of the night, the brain rebounds into a state of hyperactivation. REM sleep, which is concentrated in the second half of the night, is dramatically suppressed. Slow-wave sleep, already consumed in the first half, does not repeat. The second half of the night becomes fragmented, light, and restless. The consequence is a night that feels like it began well, but ends poorly, and a morning that carries the cognitive and physical signatures of sleep deprivation, regardless of how many hours were spent in bed. Memory consolidation, which occurs during REM sleep, is impaired. The emotional regulation that REM provides is disrupted, and the inflammatory clearance and neural maintenance that REM facilitates is incomplete. After 40, REM sleep is already naturally shortening as part of normal aging. Alcohol suppresses what remains. Every alcohol-assisted night is a night where the brain's most cognitively restorative sleep stage is partially erased, a cost that manifests the next day as reduced mental sharpness, lower mood resilience, and the kind of generalized cognitive flatness that people over 40 frequently attribute to stress or aging, rather than to what they drank the night before. There is also a cortisol dimension. As alcohol metabolizes overnight, it triggers a cortisol release in the early morning hours, often producing early waking between 3 and 5 a.m. that people consistently attribute to stress or insomnia rather than the alcohol consumed 6 hours earlier. This early morning cortisol spike disrupts the final sleep cycles, raises fasting blood glucose, and starts the following day's adrenal clock in an already depleted state. And alcohol suppresses melatonin, the hormone that not only initiates sleep, but plays a direct role in overnight antioxidant activity and immune function. After 40, melatonin production is already declining. Alcohol reduces it further at precisely the hours when it should be at its highest. Pro tip: if you drink regularly in the evening, the most evidence-aligned change is not necessarily elimination, but cutoff time and quantity management. Finishing alcohol by 7 p.m. rather than 9 p.m. allows more complete metabolism before sleep and significantly reduces the second half sleep disruption. Reducing to 1 drink rather than 2 or 3 on evenings before important days is not a compromise. It is a meaningful sleep architecture decision. Tracking your sleep quality on the morning after drinking versus not drinking, using even a basic wearable, tends to produce the kind of concrete personal evidence that motivates sustained change more effectively than general advice. Number 3, exposing yourself to screens and bright light. The screen before bed warning is so commonly repeated that most people have developed a kind of immunity to it. They have heard it, they don't fully believe it applies to them, and they continue scrolling. I want to give you the actual biology, specific enough that you understand not just that it's harmful, but precisely what it is doing to your hormonal system and why it is worse after 40 than it was at 25. The mechanism runs through melatonin, but the full story goes considerably deeper than most explanations cover. Melatonin is produced by the pineal gland in response to darkness, beginning roughly 2 hours after your habitual sunset. Its job is not simply to make you sleepy, though it does that. It is a master circadian signal that coordinates the timing of dozens of biological processes: immune activity, antioxidant defense, cellular repair, hormonal secretion, and the precise sequencing of sleep stages. When melatonin is suppressed or delayed, All of these processes are disrupted in downstream ways that extend far beyond difficulty falling asleep. Blue light, the wavelength emitted most intensely by phones, tablets, LED televisions, and overhead lights, is the specific input that suppresses melatonin production most aggressively. It activates specialized photoreceptors in the retina, called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which send a direct signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, your brain's master circadian clock, that it is still daytime. The melatonin signal is suppressed accordingly. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that evening blue light exposure delayed melatonin onset by an average of 90 minutes and reduced total melatonin levels by approximately 50% compared to reading a printed book under dim light. That is not a marginal effect. Halving melatonin production and delaying it by 90 minutes means the entire cascade of circadian-timed biological processes is running 90 minutes behind schedule in a body that has a fixed wake time the following morning. After 40, melatonin production has already declined significantly from its peak levels. Production at 45 is meaningfully lower than at 25, and it continues declining with each decade. When you are starting from a reduced baseline, a 50% suppression from screen exposure is not the same physiological event it was in your 20s. You are suppressing a system that is already operating with less capacity. The downstream consequences, shallower sleep, reduced slow wave depth, impaired overnight immune function, disrupted growth hormone timing, are proportionally more significant. There is also a cognitive activation dimension that compounds the light effect. Screens, particularly social media, news, and video content, are designed to maintain engagement through novelty, emotional activation, and variable reward. The neurological state this produces, heightened dopaminergic activation, sustained prefrontal cortex engagement, emotional arousal, is physiologically incompatible with the parasympathetic downregulation that healthy sleep onset requires. Your brain needs a transition period from the alert, reactive state of daytime engagement to the quiet, inward state from which sleep can emerge naturally. Screens eliminate that transition. Pro tip: the minimum effective intervention is shifting screens off 60 minutes before your target sleep time and replacing them with low stimulation, low blue light activity. Reading physical books or an e-reader on the lowest warm light setting, light stretching, conversation, or simply sitting in dim, warm light. If eliminating screens is not practical, blue light blocking glasses with a genuine amber lens, not the mild yellow tints marketed as blue light glasses, meaningfully preserve melatonin levels during screen use. Dimming all overhead lighting to warm, low-lux sources from the early evening replicates the light environment your melatonin system was designed for and compounds the benefit of screen management. Number 2, doing intense exercise. Exercise is unambiguously one of the most powerful health interventions available to people over 40. This entry is not an argument against exercise. It is an argument about timing, because the specific physiological effects of intense exercise in the hours before sleep are significantly more disruptive after 40 than most people realize. When you exercise intensely, anything that substantially elevates heart rate and produces meaningful exertion, your body mounts a significant stress response. Cortisol rises sharply to mobilize energy substrates. Adrenaline and noradrenaline elevate, increasing heart rate, blood pressure, and sympathetic nervous system activation. Core body temperature rises by 1 to 2 degrees. And the neurological state of alertness and arousal that exercise produces is the result of direct activation of the same systems that need to be quiet for sleep to begin. The physiological after effects of intense exercise take considerably longer to resolve than most people assume. Core body temperature elevation, one of the primary signals your body uses to determine that sleep is not yet appropriate, can persist for 4 to 5 hours after intense exertion. Cortisol elevation from a hard evening workout can remain significantly above baseline for 2 to 3 hours. Sympathetic nervous system activation from high-intensity training does not simply switch off when you stop moving. After 40, this resolution takes longer for a specific reason. The autonomic nervous system, the regulatory system that governs the shift from sympathetic activation to parasympathetic recovery, becomes less agile with age. The transition from the activated high-arousal state produced by intense exercise to the calm, parasympathetically dominant state required for sleep onset is measurably slower. What a 25-year-old resolves in 60 minutes takes a 45-year-old 90 to 120 minutes, sometimes more. Exercising at 9 p.m. and expecting restorative sleep by 10:30 p.m. is asking your autonomic nervous system to perform a transition that the research consistently shows it cannot reliably complete in that window after 40. There is also a sleep architecture consequence beyond just delayed onset. Even when people fall asleep relatively quickly after late intense exercise, polysomnography studies, which measure sleep stages objectively, show that slow-wave sleep is reduced and sleep fragmentation is increased compared to nights following earlier exercise. The body's elevated metabolic state and incomplete sympathetic wind-down continues to interfere with deep sleep architecture, even when sleep onset feels normal. The tragedy of this for energy is direct. Late exercise produces worse sleep quality, which produces more fatigue the following day, which reduces motivation and physical capacity for exercise, which can drive people to push harder or later to compensate, reinforcing the cycle. Pro tip: finish intense exercise at least 3 hours before your target sleep time. 4 to 5 hours is optimal for most people over 40, given the slower autonomic recovery rate. Morning and early afternoon exercise produce the best sleep outcomes and the strongest circadian alignment of cortisol with the natural daytime activity period. If evening is the only practical time to train, shifting from high intensity to moderate or low intensity modalities, a walk, yoga, light resistance training, in the 2 hours before bed preserves the movement habit without the sleep-disruptive sympathetic activation. The sleep quality gains from this timing shift often produce better athletic performance and recovery than the additional intensity would have anyway. Number 1, running mental loops and failing to close the day. This is number 1 not because it is the most dramatic-sounding item on the list, but because it is the one that operates most invisibly, affects the most people over 40, and has the most direct and underappreciated impact on the hormonal system that everything else on this list depends on. By the time you reach 40, your life has a complexity. Career pressures, financial responsibilities, relationships, health concerns, the cognitive load of managing a household, often aging parents, often growing children. That is simply not present at 25. The volume of open loops, unresolved decisions, and unprocessed concerns that your brain is carrying into the bedroom by evening is categorically different from what it carried a decade earlier. And the physiological consequence of carrying those loops across the sleep boundary is cortisol. Cortisol follows a diurnal curve. It should be high in the morning, declining through the day, and low by evening to allow melatonin to rise and sleep to begin. Mental activation. The kind produced by reviewing unfinished work, replaying difficult conversations, running financial calculations, or anticipating tomorrow's demands, keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged and the sympathetic nervous system active. And an active sympathetic nervous system means elevated cortisol regardless of the time of day or how dark and quiet the room is. Chronically elevated evening cortisol is one of the most consistent findings in people who report difficulty sleeping after 40. Not elevated cortisol from acute stress, but the low-grade persistent elevation that comes from a brain that never receives a clear signal that the day is over and that further cognitive processing is neither required nor productive. The hormonal consequences extend well beyond insomnia. Cortisol and melatonin are physiological antagonists. When one is elevated, the other is suppressed. Elevated evening cortisol delays and reduces melatonin production. Less melatonin means slower sleep onset, shallower sleep architecture, reduced overnight antioxidant activity, and impaired growth hormone secretion. All of the consequences we have discussed throughout this list, converging on a single upstream driver. Cortisol and testosterone also have an inverse relationship. Chronically elevated evening cortisol suppresses testosterone in both men and women, which reduces the capacity for overnight muscle repair, lowers morning energy and motivation, and contributes to the body composition changes that accumulate through the 40s. It is not incidental that the demographic with the highest rates of chronic evening cortisol elevation, high-achieving, high-responsibility adults in middle age, is also the demographic where unexplained fatigue, body composition changes, and low motivation are most prevalent. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for planning, problem-solving, and worry, does not distinguish between genuinely productive evening thinking and unproductive rumination. Both feel like necessary cognitive work. Both maintain the same cortisol elevation. The critical insight is that no amount of late evening mental processing actually resolves the problems it is reviewing. It rehearses them, sustains the stress response they generate, and then carries them unresolved into a night of compromised sleep. The intervention is not meditation or positive thinking. It is a deliberate, structured close-of-day process that gives the prefrontal cortex a concrete signal that the review period has ended. Research from Florida State University by psychologist Roy Baumeister found that writing down unfinished tasks and specific plans to address them, rather than simply thinking about them, significantly reduced intrusive thoughts about those tasks and improved the ability to disengage from them cognitively. The act of externalizing open loops into a written plan appears to satisfy the brain's goal monitoring systems enough to allow genuine mental disengagement. Pro tip: build a consistent close-of-day ritual that takes 10 to 15 minutes and runs at the same time each evening. Write down the 3 most important things left unresolved from the day and a specific, concrete next action for each one. Not a general intention, but an action. Then write the 3 most important things you will address tomorrow. This is not a to-do list exercise. It is a neurological offloading process. Once the open loops are on paper with a committed next action, the brain's background monitoring of those items is substantially reduced. Evening cortisol begins to decline on schedule, and the hormonal conditions for restorative sleep can actually develop. Here is what the research makes clear. The quality of your sleep after 40 is not primarily determined by what happens when you get into bed. It is determined by the 2 to 3 hours before you get into bed, the hormonal environment you build or destroy through each of these 5 habits in that window every evening. Late eating suppresses growth hormone. Alcohol eliminates REM. Screens delay melatonin. Late intense exercise keeps cortisol and core temperature elevated. And unmanaged mental loops hold the entire stress response open through the night. Remove one of these from your evening, and your sleep improves. Remove several, and the change is not gradual. It is rapid, measurable, and the kind of shift that makes people wonder why nobody told them sooner. I'm Megan Corvale. I'll see you in the next one.